All right, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to our webinar today. We have a very interesting topic in discussion today, developing Citrix Workspace Microapp integrations using Microsoft Power Automate. And we have two wonderful gentlemen today as the presenters, Tom McKelvey and Pat Patterson. So before I hand this over to them, a few housekeeping details. We do have a formal Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A panel available on your GoToWebinar interface. We will try and answer questions regarding any audio issues, webinar logistics related issues on chat itself. If there are any content related questions, please keep them coming as well. And if they're relevant to individuals, we'll try and answer them over chat. If they make sense for the entire audience, we'll take them up in a formal Q&A session in the end. This webinar is also being recorded, and we'll send you a recording of the webinar in the next 24 hours. So without further ado, guys, let me hand this over to Pat. Pat, over to you.
All right, thank you, Rubel. And I'd like to thank our producer, Rubel, for reading out the title so I don't have to. But we're basically going to be looking at creating these micro apps using Microsoft Power Automate as a tool. Now, I'll just take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Pat Patterson, known pretty universally through social media as MetaDaddy. I joined Citrix a couple of months ago now as developer architect evangelist. So this is my first webinar with Citrix, and it's my role to kind of bring this community together, this developer community, and help to grow it over well, the foreseeable future. And I'm very lucky to be joined by Tom McKelvey, particularly since I've been doing evangelism for about 15 years now across Sun Microsystems, Salesforce, and a startup called StreamSets. And I'm new to the Citrix technology, so I'm very glad to have subject matter experts like Tom to work with. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. So my name is Tom McKelvey. So I'm a senior software engineer on our developer platform team. So what this means is that my role is to support developers who want to build stuff on top of the various Citrix platforms that enable developments to plug into them. So this means helping people in a hands-on way like we're doing today, and also being involved in evolving the platform and understanding what features we need to add to enable use cases for you developers to build stuff with. And I've been with Citrix for about 4 years now, so a little while longer than that.
All right, well, let's get going. So we'll be looking at the underlying problem we're trying to solve with the whole workspace with intelligence technology. And then we'll dive into the basics of how these micro apps work, what they are, and how the Power Automate tool can help us. And we'll also be just covering briefly some of the newer technology that's come out in Workspace with Intelligence, webhooks, before we wrap up. And please, if you can, stay till the end because we'll have some exciting news on upcoming events. Okay, so Tom, what's the underlying problem here? What are we trying to solve for?
Sure. So the problem we're trying to solve is one of productivity. So this graph here shows the improvement in productivity we've seen with various kind of technological shifts. So over time, we've seen as new technologies have come along, they've increasingly sped up the rates of productivity gains that we've seen, from personal computing through to the internet. But in recent years, we've seen that trend start to reverse, with the productivity gains dropping, and now in the most recent couple of years, dropping even further. But really what we're trying to look at is understanding why this is happening and what we can do to kind of reverse this trend again. So as we see it, there are kind of 3 main reasons why we're seeing this drop in productivity. And that's mainly because the applications we're using today, they're not driving productivity and they're not driving happiness. One of the first reasons for that is that we just have too many applications. So most people in their day-to-day lives have a kind of longer and longer list of applications they need to use just to get their job done, to book their holiday, to find out how much they're being paid. And all of these come with some overhead to understand them, to learn them, and to be able to use them properly. The next is that we have too much complexity. A lot of enterprise applications have now been around for years and years. And through all that time, more and more features get added to the products. And this means there's more buttons, there's more options, there's more drop downs. And often if you're just a casual user, kind of finding that simple thing that you want to do can be very hard when there's so many other options and buttons around and you can't differentiate what it is you're looking for. And the final one is that we have too many interruptions. We have too many sources trying to get our attention, pushing us notifications and information which isn't necessarily relevant to us. And that this is just leading to us kind of being interrupted from our daily work lots and lots of times and not allowing us to kind of get on with the real meat of our jobs.
And in the limit, this manifests itself as things like getting an email from Salesforce with some notification, going to the Salesforce SaaS application, clicking down 5 levels deep to find some piece of information to copy and then paste into ServiceNow, for example. This is not making people happy.
Yeah, so I won't bash any particular services, but I know certainly when I look at my inbox each morning, there are lots of applications which have pushed me details about some page I looked at 5 months ago and so someone's left a comment. And often these things aren't relevant, but it just takes that time where you have to manually filter through those and work out what you do and don't care about. But overall, we're seeing that having all these applications means we actually end up with kind of very low usage of the ones we use. So you're paying for expensive licenses for stuff that you're not really utilizing effectively. We're spending too much time searching. So we have all these complex UIs and we have to kind of manually search through to try and find what we're looking for. And it means we're spending more and more time kind of searching for stuff rather than getting on with our jobs. And that all of these things are contributing to people having too little focus. So they can't concentrate on the work they actually enjoy because they get kind of cut up and distracted by all these different sources of information.
Okay, so I was going to say, how can we help?
Sure. So what we're trying to do with the Citrix Workspace with intelligence features is learn from some of the applications we use in our kind of personal lives, which have done a lot better job kind of keeping up with a lot of technological shifts. So we have stuff like Facebook and Airbnb, and these are applications, people don't use them because they're forced to by their manager, but they use them because they are simple, they're intuitive, and they give them useful information that they're actually looking for. So what we've tried to do is try to learn from these applications and kind of extract some of those best practices and apply those throughout what we're doing. So there's 4 key things that we're trying to pull out. The first is the integrated feed. So this is on stuff like Facebook, where it's pulling out notifications from all of your friends, from the pages you follow, from the games you play, and it's presenting that to you in just one place. And you know that if you go there, you will see all the information that's relevant to you without needing to jump into different locations. The next is about notifications. So this is understanding, for this actual user, what is it they want to see, and making them aware of that proactively. So they don't need to go into the back end and search around to find stuff. You're pushing that relevant information to them directly and save them that time in doing the searching themselves. The next is about clear actions. So this is very clear in the Airbnb example. Each screen has 1 or 2 buttons on it. And this means that the whole experience is very intuitive. No one needs to read a user manual. Everyone can just understand it and get on with their work. And there's no learning curve, even if you're doing something different from you. And the final is assisting all of this with AI. So we want to make sure that the experience you have is personalized to how you use the platform. So the actions and notifications that we're presenting to you are the ones that are relevant to you as a user. And that we're learning over time to make sure that that experience gets better and better for you the more you interact with it. So the way we're trying to solve all of those problems and the way we're trying to encapsulate those behaviors we just discussed is through what we're calling a microapp. So microapp is about taking a single use case that we want to solve and using that to abstract kind of your data or your workflow or your content from your business application and present that to you in a way that doesn't need you to switch your context or launch a full application, but just to take out the things which are relevant to you and present that to you in a simple way. so that you can really simply understand what it is you need to know or do those actions that you need to do. So what this actually looks like for an end user is something like this. So this is a screenshot from what the Citrix Workspace with intelligence looks like. So we can see a few key things. So we have notifications, and we can see these notifications come from ServiceNow, from G Suite, from SAP. So this is a bit about being integrated and pulling those notifications in from all of the different sources that you might use. We also have actionable notifications. So for when you have simple actions that you can take, like approve an expense report, we want to allow you to do that as simply as possible. So within the feed card itself, you see the options you have for interacting with that, and you can click on it to approve or send it back from immediately within your feed without needing to jump out anywhere else. Last one here is actions. So as well as having the kind of proactive data we're pushing to you, we also want to give you the ability to do those standalone actions. As you can see here as well, this is a list of recommended actions. So this is making sure we're using those AI models to present you actions that you actually use. If you're in a role where you're doing lots of expense reports, that's going to be top and center for you. Whereas if you're a back-end developer somewhere and maybe you're doing that less often, we might push other things up to you which you're actually using kind of day to day. And behind all of these, when you click on this, it's not just the information you showed here, but there's also the option to kind of push out this additional context. So if you click on one of the feed cards or click on one of the actions, we display you a kind of a slightly richer experience with more context and more options. And this can be kind of a multiple pages connected together. And this is about finding kind of the minimal set of data and options you need to complete these applications without having to jump out into the backend application.
And on one of those notifications, if you did want to go and like investigate further, just why did Stella submit that $2,300 expense report, you could have a link going right to the relevant page in the application, right?
Yes. So when the backend supports that, you can deep link out. So a core part of this is that we want to abstract the simple use cases. We're not going to replicate SAP inside our workspace. We want to do the simple things, and for when you need to be a power user, we want to make it easy for you to go into SAP in the backend and do those powerful things, and make sure we're flexible and not kind of rigidly forcing you to use one way of working. Okay, so next we're going to discuss some of the basics of how these microapps actually work. So you've seen the front end and what that looks like, and next we want to kind of look at how do we get from the whole way from having some data in SAP to actually presenting that to an end user. So the first step of that is about the system of record, or sometimes we'll call that an SOR, and that's just a generic term we use to reference the application we're talking to in the backend. So this is SAP or Jira or Salesforce, any of these different systems. Then within the kind of microapp side, the first thing we have is the integration. So the integration is the part of the microapp which understands how to talk to a system of record. So this is about understanding what APIs are available in the SOR, what data comes out of those, how to do authentication, and all those different parts. And that's where we kind of put in that definition. The next thing we have is the data cache. So as part of the architecture of how this works, we try and pull out kind of a relevant subset of data from the system of record, and we store that locally in a cache because that gives us better performance later on, and it also gives us more power and more control to do kind of complex churning through that data.
And I guess it's important to point out that we're not, the goal is not to replicate Salesforce into the data cache. It really is to extract the relevant data. So it might be a subset of the fields, it might be a subset of the records, but you're really just bringing out the data that's immediately relevant.
Yes. So for example, if you're dealing with Jira, you probably don't care about the tickets that have been closed down and are 5 years old. So you would make sure that when you're pulling out this data, you have a query so that you're only pulling out data which is kind of still active for tickets which are still open and still being progressed. Because yeah, like you said, you don't want to copy everything. We just want to copy the stuff that's relevant and we're actually going to be using to show to our end users. So the next thing we have here is the Microapp builder. So this is the kind of the tools that you're presented as an admin if you're building something on the workspace. And this is the collection of low code and no code tools that you use to build out the integration definitions and build out the definitions of what the UI components look like. Within the Microapp itself, so this is where we're building out the UI elements. So that has two components. We have the page. So this is where we define what you actually see in the UI. And next is the event. So this is where we define what criteria have to be met for you actually to be pushed a notification. So once again, because we have the data in the cache, we can build very powerful event logic. So we can be as specific as you want to make sure that we're only generating those notifications when they're actually really relevant to you. And then the last part of this is the end user experience. So regardless of whether you're using the Workspace app on your phone, or you're using the Workspace UI or the Workspace desktop app, we're able to deliver a consistent experience across all of those and get these notifications and these actions exposed to your users, however it is that they do their work and they interact with this system.
And it's worth mentioning here, we have a learning journey that walks you through all of these stages for a simple example using Jira. So if you're new to this technology, I highly recommend you you walk through that quick start.
Yes. So at the end, we'll share some links to exactly where you can find that. But yeah, we have a number of walkthroughs which take you through this in much more depth. So today we're kind of having a high-level discussion. If you really want to get nitty-gritty and down there, we have lots more other materials you can explore. So now we're going to walk through, how we take these different pieces and how data actually moves through the system. So the first thing that happens is the integration makes an API call to the system of record, and the system of record returns some data. And we do this periodically to pull out the relevant data from the cache, the relevant data from the system of record, and this is how we find new data and work out when notifications should be generated. So this is a periodic polling which is done to the system of record, and this is authenticated using a service account credentials who has access to all of the data in the back end, so we can pull out all of the user's information from the system of record. Once we pull that information out, we push it into the cache. So the cache is obviously secured and it's siloed, so it's only per customer, so nice and safe. From there, we start using the data in the cache to populate the UI, and we start checking if our notification criteria have been met. And in cases where they have, we then push those notifications through the end user experience so the end user can actually consume them. It's worth noting here as well that we have this extra blob for Citrix Analytics Service. So this is the service through which all of our telemetry goes. So every time a user interacts with a card or clicks an action or gets sent a notification, all of this goes through the analytics service. So we can build out a model of how they're interacting with these different integrations so that we can build them that kind of personalized experience. And obviously, as well as being able to pull data out to the end user, we also allow users to write back their changes. So when they click the approve expense report, they are authenticating as themselves, and using OAuth, we're able to use those user credentials to write that data back directly to the system of record. So that in real time, they can approve expense report, and that change gets written directly back into the system of record. And then we can refresh the cache to make sure that we're always in sync between what we have in the cache and what's actually in the system of records databases. So once we've done this for one application, obviously the next step is that we want to connect all of the different applications that our users interact with each day. So to help you do that, we have a number of pre-built integrations and micro apps that we allow you to use. So you can see a selection of them here. So when we'll go into the workspace later, you will see that these are ones that we make available to you directly. So you can just click on these, type in the credentials of your particular SAP instance, and get going very quickly. However, today we have 15 of these pre-built integrations, but obviously many people are going to have additional requirements or kind of bespoke integrations that they need to integrate. And for those, we have something called the HTTP integration. So the HTTP integration is a tool which we provide, which allows you to customize and build a custom integration and micro app for your particular use case. So it's based on using RESTful JSON APIs via HTTP. So any system of record which exposes these APIs can theoretically be connected up using the HTTP integration. It's worth noting, though, that if you're doing this, it does require you to have an understanding of how the SOR's API works. So you need to understand what APIs you want to talk to, how you authenticate with those, what the data structures look like. So whilst it's no code and low code, it does require some kind of technical competency to really understand how to do that well.
Yeah, we're just really removing the need to write that boilerplate that's just going to be the same for any SOR that to pull the JSON.
Yes, so it's very simple to build. A lot of the difficulty is in that upfront kind of planning to understand what data you need to expose to your end users to allow them to do the use cases they want to. But this complexity is actually one of the kind of main ways in which actually Power Automate can help. So Power Automate has over 300 pre-built connections. So these are systems where Microsoft has gone through and they've worked out which APIs to talk to, how to authenticate with them. And they have 300 of those which are pre-built and available for you. So we can see here, we scanned through very quickly, but they have a wide range of systems which people would use, Twitter, WebEx, all sorts of systems which you might need to integrate to enable your users' use cases. And theoretically, these can help us kind of get over some of that technical knowledge that you might need to have if you were to build it yourself.
And this used to be called Flow, right? Oh, there we go. Formerly Microsoft Flow. So in a marketing stroke of genius, they replaced a single syllable name with 5.
Yes. So now we're going to just step back a bit and we're going to discuss what Power Automate kind of is. Like Pat said, it used to be called Microsoft Flow. This is what I originally knew it as. So if I swap between the two, I apologize, but they are essentially the same thing. And additionally, the kind of flow terminology is used in a few places just to keep it kind of extra confusing for you. So what is Power Automate? So primarily, Power Automate is a no-code workflow builder. So if you've ever used If This Then That, or Zapier, or these other similar platforms, it provides a very similar role. It's about connecting up systems of records, doing kind of logic and transformations, and doing that all using a kind of easy UI building block for it. Power Automate has support for cross-system of record flows, so you can tie together all your different system of records to kind of push data from Excel to Outlook to Teams or whatever it is you want to do. And it also supports data transformations and kind of simple logic. So you can chop and change data as you need to fit into the different systems as they require it. Power Automate, however, is not a UI. So once again, like If This Then That, it kind of presents a way for you to build these workflows, but it does not present a nice user-facing way to trigger those workflows or to view the results of the workflows. And this is where you need to plug it into something else.
So it's very complementary to what we're doing with microapps.
Yes, we'll go through this more, but yes, it's very complementary. As you can see that, this is a mechanism for complex workflows, and it needs a nice UI to expose it. And obviously, a big part of the workspace experience is giving you that consistent and sort of simple user interface. So certainly, even just theoretically, there's a lot of synergy to be had there. So those individual workflows that you build, known as flows, and here is just kind of a very simple diagram of what a kind of generic recipe for a flow looks like. So the first thing that you have for every flow is you need some way to trigger that flow to start. So in the case we'll be going through, we'll be using a HTTP request to trigger a flow, but theoretically it could also be something like a time-based flow, or it could use webhooks, or a whole bunch of other options. Once your flow is triggered, the next thing you need to do is run your logic behind it. So this is where you actually do kind of the meat of the workflow. So you interact with the different systems of records, you do your data transformations. This is kind of a generic lump for all sorts of stuff you could do in the middle here. And then at the end of the flow, we need to return some data to the original client to say, what happened? Did the workflow work? What data has come out of it? We need to return all this information so the user can understand, was it a success? And what data do they need to know that's come out of it? So if we think about how that kind of general flow would plug into the microapp diagram we saw earlier, it would look a little something like this. So we would have our integration. Our integration makes an API call to our trigger in Microsoft Power Automate. That then kicks off the logic. Microsoft Power Automate then starts making API calls to this system of record and starts pulling out the data that you need and doing the logic that you want. Once that's complete, it then takes this data and it returns it back to the integration. From that point, we follow the same use case, the same flow as before. So we take that data, we put it in the cache, we generate our microapps, and then we push that data to our end users. Essentially what Microsoft Flow is doing here is it's adding a middle layer in between the HTTP integration and the system of records that allows us to add in some more complex logic. It handles some of the complexities of understanding how to talk to the system of records. And it also can do some additional steps in terms of data transformations and stuff like that.
So you could look up keys and turn them into values and all of that interesting stuff.
Yes. When we go through the demo a little bit later on, you'll see that they have a kind of, I wouldn't call it a coding language because they call it kind of no code, but essentially like a logic language similar to what you would find in your Excel formulas. That theoretically can allow you to define kind of arbitrarily complex logic, although it can be a bit messy because it's not the most kind of clean format for doing that sort of thing. So this is just one example of what a flow could look like. So this was actually something that a colleague of mine sent to me that they just happened to build to kind of enable a use case they had. So this is not someone who's a developer, so this is just to give you an example of the sort of complex flow that someone who's not necessarily got development skills can even build for themselves. So you can see just that kind of quick scan down, but obviously they have multiple branches for different logic. They have deduplication steps, data transformation steps, parsing steps, and all of this enables you to kind of enable all these really kind of complex and potentially very useful workflows. So theoretically, by using this kind of recipe of having trigger, logic, response, you can theoretically plug in any of those 300 plus connectors into this flow and enable you to get started very quickly building out use cases for those connections. So to kind of summarize all of this, so we have the workspace UI, which in this case is handling the complexities of the UI and making sure users get the notifications on all of their devices. And then we have Power Automate, which is handling the complexities of the system of record interactions and of the workflow creation itself. And combining these things together, we have quite a winning formula. It is worth noting, though, that there are some caveats to that. So if you are considering this as a route for building out a microapp, there are also some negatives you have to kind of take into account. So the first is that whilst Power Automate gives you upfront simplicity, so kind of plug and play with your different connectors, this comes at the cost of extra long-term complexity. So we're adding another layer here to our interaction. This means that if we need to debug a problem, we have more places to look. It means that if you need to make a change, you have to propagate that through additional layers. And then if this is something you're planning to really productize and use long term, that these costs can build up. Additionally, we're going to have worse performance. So once again, we're going through additional layers. We're sending data through more steps. So this is going to have a performance cost, particularly if you're doing a very data intensive use case. This could really be a problem for you. And the final one is that with Power Automate, it can only ever use the authentication of a single administrator user for all of the actions it does. This means that you can't make use of the kind of per user authentication that I mentioned right at the beginning. So this can limit some of the use cases that are possible. And obviously we need to balance this against the positives, which we said earlier. So data transformation being possible means that lots of use cases which you couldn't normally do are now enabled by Power Automate. Pass Automate can obviously make things very simple. So if you just want to get going with a proof of concept, that may be worth it to you. And also the cross system of record workflows are very powerful, and they're not something you can do natively in the same way just with the HTTP integration. So overall, we recommend using Power Automate when the use case you want to do isn't possible using the HTTP integration directly. And in general, you should try and default to using HTTP integration and jump out to Power Automate when you need to do something which isn't normally possible. Okay, so you've had some of the backgrounds and some of the caveats. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and put that all together. So for you today, I have a recorded demo. Apologies, I'm not a video editor, so there are some very bad jump cuts. But this is just a faster way to kind of walk you through the process. So the use case I'm going to be showing you today is we're building a micro app which allows users to define a location they want to see a weather report for, to dynamically fetch the latest weather report for that location, and then to view those results. So this is actually a very simple use case, but it's one that wouldn't normally be possible with the native HTTP integration, for reasons we'll cover in more details when we go into the video. So we will now review the video. So just start. So the first thing we're going to do in our flow is we're going to log in to Power Automate, and we're going to create a new flow there. So here, this is the Power Automate UI, and we're going to select an instant flow. We're going to give that a name, and then underneath, we're going to select what kind of trigger we want to use. So in this case, we're using the HTTP request, which is what we mentioned earlier. As a next step, we now need to configure this HTTP endpoint. So we need to say what data is going to be passed in this request. So what I've done just here is I've defined the schema for the JSON that we're going to pass in the body. So in this case, we're passing a single field, which is called location and has a type string. We then set the method to be a post, and we've set an additional option at the bottom here for relative path. So this means, as well as passing information in the body, we also can use a relative path appended to the end of the URL to pass through additional data if we need to. Once we've done that, we're going to put in our next step. So in this case, we're using one of the pre-built MSN weather connections, and we're going to be using the get current weather action. So when we click on that, you can see here with the stars, these are the fields we need to pass to this action in order for it to work. And when we click on them, we can see here we have this dynamic content section. So this is when MS Flow works out what parameters you've already specified and presents you kind of intelligent options about what data you might want to pass in that location. In this use case though, we're going to do something a little bit more complicated, and we're going to make use of the expression language that Power Automate supports. So in this case, I've just pasted it in plain text here. So what we're doing is we're checking if we've included a relative path in the request. If we've included a relative path, we pass that as the location value. If we haven't, we then use the one that's in the body. And obviously you can see that this is what I was mentioning earlier. It's not quite code. This is a similar format to the Excel functions. Next, we're going to change the units to metric because that's what I like to use. I'm now going to create the final stage of our flow, which is the response. So we've now triggered the flow. We've got the weather report. And once I can eventually find it in this list, I should have probably cut this bit out. We will now define what we're going to return to our endpoint. So once again, here we have the list of dynamically generated options. So these are all of the bits of data which are returned to us by the get current weather action. And we can select which of those we want to return in our response. In this case, I'm going to use the body because this includes all of the data about the weather. Now, once we click save and we go back to the HTTP request, we can see in a second that this will now present us the URL that we need to talk to. So this is the URL we need to go to trigger this HTTP trigger. Now we're going to jump over into the workspace configuration. So this is the Microapp's admin view. So just to give you an example, so this is the list of pre-built integrations that we make available. So these are the ones you can get started with immediately. But obviously for today, we're going to be using the HTTP integration. So that's what I'm going to select here. And we're going to start off by naming that. I just put 0 at the front so it appears at the top of the list. And then in the base URL, we're going to specify the sort of domain of the URL, which was automatically generated by Microsoft Flow.
So you just copied that out of that Flow configuration and pasted it straight in here.
Yes. So one thing to note is that in this case, we're not going to be using any authentication. So Power Automate doesn't support stuff like OAuth or those complex mechanisms. What they do to secure their endpoints is they basically insert some kind of randomly generated UIDs and signatures into the URL endpoint, and they kind of secure it in that way. So once we put in our base URL, we're just going to save that. We don't have to touch any of the authentication stuff. And then once that's done, we will start defining the endpoints we're going to talk to. So this data loading section, this is where we define the endpoints that we talk to. So we're going to give that a name. I think I typo this and have to rewrite it. And then after we've named it, we then have to specify the endpoint URI. So this is kind of the full path. So once again, this is just copied out from Microsoft Flow. We're then going to set our request method to post because this is what we configured on MS Flow. And then next we have to specify some query strings. So I kind of cut ahead here, but basically these are also from the MS Flow definition, and these are extra strings that they add to add some security to their endpoint. So you just need to copy and paste this in from MS Flow. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to specify the format of the body. So as I mentioned before, we have a single thing that we're passing, which is location. And in this case, I'm just putting a default value in of Cambridge because that's where I'm based today. And next we can click test service. When we click test service, what this does is it makes an API call to that location we've specified. And this is how you can validate that everything's working as expected. So when we scroll down here, we can see this is an example of the data that's returned to us by this flow. Next, we need to build the table structures that will go into our cache and that we'll be using to store this data in. So when we click the fetch JSON structure from API, what this does is it makes an API call to Power Automate, and then based on the JSON data that's returned, it automatically works out what tables and what columns and what fields we need in our database. In this particular instance, you can see we have this extra metadata at the end of this JSON, and we actually don't want to include that in our table at all. So what we can do is we can change the kind of root path. So this is changing what part of the JSON we look at, and that way we can kind of ignore all that metadata. So in this list, you can now see these are all the tables that we've automatically, these are all the columns for the table that have been automatically identified. And what we're going to do next is we decide which of these needs to be the primary key. In this case, we're going to use location because we want to obviously have kind of unique data per location. So once we click save on that, we now have one API endpoint defined that allows us to pull in information from MS Flow. So the next thing we're going to do is define a service action. So service actions are the actions that could be triggered by an end user. So the API endpoint is when we pull stuff out with the integration, and the service action is when the user clicks a button in their feed. This is what we're triggering behind the scenes. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating a service action which allows users to specify which location they want to look up the weather for. So we have a parameter which we're defining called location, and once again I'm just putting in a default value of Cambridge, but when we build out the UI later on, users will be able to change that for themselves. Next, we need to specify which API endpoint we're talking to for the service action. So this is just copying in the same data that we had from the endpoint. And as the final step, we're using a fairly recently added feature, which is called data update after action. So what this functionality allows us to do is that when we write a change back to the system of record, we can then kind of just pull out a single record from the system of records, the one that we've just changed, and pull that into our cache. So this is what we're using here to allow users, so they've said they want to look up the weather for London, and then we can write back to Flow to say we want the weather report for London, and then we take that value that they give us, so the weather report, and we push that into our cache. So here,
Thank you, Tom, for not making us sit through you copying and pasting all those parameters, by the way.
Yes.
This is why we record demos sometimes rather than doing them live.
Yes, I was not able to do it anywhere near fast enough live. But here, so you can see just to kind of cut off slightly on the right-hand side of the screen, we've typed the word location there. So that's between two curly brackets. So in the syntax of the Microapp builder, the two curly brackets is basically how you say something is a parameter, which should be swapped out with another value. So what we do here is we're saying this location at the end of the URL is going to be swapped out with a location that is supplied by the user. And now we're going to save this. So at this point, our integration is all configured. And the next step is that we're going to go build out the microapps that are going to be in the UI in front of this. So we're going to go ahead and add some microapps to our integration. And then we're going to go into those and start building out the UI elements. So the first thing we need to do is give them a proper name and set an icon. So we're just going to do that very quickly. We set an icon, we click save, and now we need to just start defining the UI elements. So it's worth noting this is when we create a page, we have 4 template options. So this is to make your life easier. We kind of give you some preset options for types of pages you might commonly use. The one we're going to be using for this particular case is a form. So this is, when a user is filling in some details and submitting them to you. Next, we select if there's any table fields we want to show. In this case, there's not. So we can just go ahead and click save. So now this is the kind of low-code tool that we have for building microapps. So on the left, we have the options for kind of the UI components you can use. In the middle, we have the kind of what you see is what you get preview. So this allows you to build out the structure of your microapp. And on the right-hand side, we have the properties, which allows you to configure these UI elements. So in this case, we're going to have a text input. This is where the user is going to type in the location they want to look up. We're going to have 2 buttons. One of those buttons will be used to trigger the service action so that we update the location. And the second will be used to take us to another page where we can actually look at that weather report. So what we're going to do here is for this first button, we're going to configure it to run a service action. And then we're going to select which service action we want to run. So we want to do the update location one we created a moment ago. Next, once again, this is slightly cut off, but what we're doing here is we're specifying when we run this action, we need to pass something for the location. So what we're specifying is that the text field that we fill in on this page, that's what we're going to be passing as the location to our action. Now that's done, we're going to rename this button so users know what it is. And then we're also going to add a name for our last button. So this will be the button we click on to go view the weather report. Obviously, before we can link this to another page, we're now going to go create that second page in which you can actually view the weather reports. So here we're going to do a big jump cut because it's basically the same thing again. But what we're creating here is a page in which you can view the location of the weather report you're looking at and a summary of the weather for that location. So apparently yesterday in Bengaluru, it was light rain at the time that I did this. We can also see for kind of aesthetic reasons, I've added a title called weather report to this page, and at the top I've added a back button. This allows users to kind of navigate back and forth between the different pages that are built into the microapp. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're now going to link this view location button so that it takes us to the page. So we're going to use the go to page action, select which page that takes us to, and the final thing we're going to do is set the target page record. So what this does is this means that when we look at the details, what it's going to do is it's going to filter the results so that we're looking at the detail page for the location we just set. So it checks, we've got London typed into our box. It's going to make sure you then view the weather report for London. So this is our now all configured, and now we're going to jump into the workspace and actually see what this looks like for an end user. So I'm going to now click on my weather microapp. In my location, I'm going to search for Cambridge because I'm unable to spell it. We click update location, so this now writes back to MS Flow with the Cambridge value set, and then it pulls that new weather report into our cache. And then when I click view location, this shows us the weather report for Cambridge. Now I'll look up Santa Clara, so this will give us Pat's weather report from yesterday. And when we update location, and once again pulls in the latest data for Santa Clara, and we can see that yesterday in Santa Clara it was mostly cloudy.
That's quite unusual that it's sunny in the UK and cloudy here, I have to say.
Yeah, don't worry, it's rectified itself. It's a good thing I didn't record this today. It wouldn't have been quite as nice a picture. But yeah, so that is a kind of a whistle-stop tour of our demo. So the next thing I wanted to cover today is to kind of discuss some possible kind of advanced use cases that you can also explore. So we're going to be discussing webhook listeners. So for anyone who's been involved with the kind of developer community for a little while, you'll know that webhook listeners was something that was very, very frequently asked for, and is now something we've added to the product. So we're going to discuss today just a few ways that you can use this. So how webhooks work is that rather than relying on the integration polling the system of records, with webhooks, the system of record is proactively looking for when there's changed data. So it's running its own checks to look for when something changes. And when there's new data, it pushes that directly to the webhook listener. So this is via a REST API once again. So we configure an endpoint where we listen. And when the system of record sees something has changed, it pushes it directly to us. We then follow the same flow of going into the cache, pushing it to end users, etc. So the big advantage of this is that we don't have to pull in all of the data. We mentioned earlier having proper filters to make sure you only pull in kind of relevant data, but this is an even better system because this way we're guaranteed to only get data which is active and which users want to see. It also means we're acting in kind of real time. So the system of record pushes the notification to us as something changes, and we can then push that through to the user kind of in near real time to give them a much more reactive experience to when things are changing. The only problem with this is that the way webhooks are implemented in different system of records varies significantly. So whilst we can work with some, we've seen that there's some particular systems of record which either have kind of weird data dependencies or have some advanced authentication steps, which we're just not able to talk to natively directly from the webhook listener to today. So once again, this is where Power Automate can come in handy. So Power Automate has the ability to use webhook listeners as a trigger. So they're able to listen in to the data being pushed from the system of records. Then as part of the logic, they can make additional requests to the system of records. So for example, if you get a webhook that says there's a new email, but it doesn't tell you anything else, Power Automate is able to make additional API calls to follow up and pull in that additional context about what that email is, you know, who sent it, who's it for, what's the content, and they're able to pull in all the extra details and do that data transformation that we might need. From there, it can push it into the return, and once again to the webhook listener and through back to the end user. So by using Power Automate along with webhooks, we're once again able to build a lot more use cases which wouldn't be natively possible. I think particularly here, there's a lot of kind of strong use cases for using Power Automate, particularly because of this ability to make additional API calls to give that extra context.
All right, well, let's bring it home.
Perfect. So there's a few things I want to share with you to start off with before I hand over to Pat. So the first is that if any of you are interested in building microapps for yourself, you can go ahead and get a free test instance. So if you go to developer.cloud.com/Citrix Workspace, you'll see there's a great big button at the top for getting your test instance. So this gives you an instance which lasts 30 days, and you can renew it to theoretically make it last infinitely, as long as you're using it actively. Also, the links on this page and the links we're going to discuss everywhere else, Ruben will also be sharing them with you afterwards, so don't feel the need to kind of screenshot these pages. But this is kind of the first page you should go if you're interested in starting developing on the workspace. The next thing is that, this is what Pat hinted at earlier, we have a number of walkthroughs and guides that we make available to kind of walk you through more step-by-step how the process works. So on the same Citrix Workspace page, if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a button for Build Workspace Microapp Integrations. And if you click through on that, you'll see a whole bunch of different walkthroughs that we make available, including one about how to build a microapp for Microsoft Power Automate. So that is actually an article that I wrote, and it covers the content we've discussed today, but in a lot more depth and kind of step-by-step guides to how you can go about recreating the integration we've created here today. You can also see on the left-hand side, we have a number of other articles, so teaching you, how to set up your workspace to begin with, lots of different use cases you can build, and really giving you all the information you need to kind of start making stuff for yourself. The second to last plug I'm going to do is for the community forum. So if you want to cheat and you don't actually want to have to go and recreate the integration, if you go to the community forum, so this URL we will definitely share via Ruble. This is a forum where we give people the opportunity to share the integrations they've built with each other. So up here, I have a listing for the weather microapp that I've created today. So you can actually go to the community forum, you can download that microapp and you can import it to your customer and get started immediately. Also, if you end up building anything cool for yourself, this is a really great place to go to share that. So we can start building out a kind of community of people sharing ideas and helping everyone to build better integrations. So these are some of the links. One other thing to note is that if you want to build on Power Automate in particular, they do offer free trials as well. So if you go to the link here, or if you just Google free Power Apps, you'll be able to find how to sign up for that as well. And the last thing from me is around the Citrix Developer Program. So if you've started building microapps for yourself and you want to start getting those out to customers and start getting those into the marketplace, the Citrix Developer Program is how you go about this. So this is an extra program for those people who want to take it a bit more serious. And this will help you get building, this will help you learn, and then share the stuff that you build with customers. And once again, if you go to developer.cloud.com, you can find much more information there.
And I guess a relevant word there is monetize. You could actually sell these micro apps as well as just share them.
Yes.
All right. So thanks, Tom. Just awesome content. And I'm really just going to plug a couple of items here. The first is that we will be having another Citrix Converge conference later this year. Now, obviously, in the current environment, this will be a virtual conference, and it'll run for the first 2 weeks of November, so from the 2nd to the 13th. And last time round, if you attended the first Citrix Converge, it was very, very much focused on the workspace with intelligence. And this time, we're really expanding that scope to include the other product lines. So workspace orchestration, which I guess is better known as CVAD, and also workspace and app delivery, also known as networking. Now, we'll be sharing much more detail on Converge over the next few weeks, but please, if you have an idea for a session, we will have of the order, I think, of about 40 breakout sessions presented as webinars. Please get your thinking caps on if you want to present one of those, and that URL there, that bit.ly Converge Speakers 2020, will let you submit your session proposal, and we'll evaluate all of those and build a great program of content. And then one last thing that I wanted to mention before we go to Q&A is, really, if you want to stay in the loop and get information on Converge, on webinars, other news that's relevant for developers, there's 3 avenues here. The first is the Citrix Developer Newsletter. So that's an email newsletter. It's once a month. It's curated, so it's all relevant detail for developers. And you can go to that bit.ly link I created there, bit.ly CTX Dev News. The second is the Twitter account. So the Citrix Developer Twitter account, as well as having links to blog entries, it will have heads up on events and webinars and more information on Converge as it draws closer. And then if you're particularly interested in building micro apps and putting them in the Citrix Microapp marketplace, then the Citrix Ready Twitter account is really going to be relevant for you. That's really for partners building microapps that they want to get into the hands of Citrix customers. So with that, we went a little bit over, but we have a few minutes left for questions, and we've got a couple of great questions here. So yeah, there's a good question here. How is what we're talking about here different from Microsoft Power Apps?
So I am not super familiar with Power Apps, so I couldn't tell you particularly. I don't know if we have anyone on the line who's particularly familiar with Power Apps who could jump in. I mean, my understanding, I'll babble a bit until someone else can correct me if they know better, but my understanding is that Power Apps does something vaguely similar. The advantage of using the workspace, however, is that obviously many people are already using the workspace and storefront as the home for their desktops and their virtual apps. And obviously, when you're using the workspace with intelligence, we're using the same interface. So we'll be pulling in information from ShareFile about your content, as well as Dropbox, whatever else. And we're also pulling in your workspace, your apps, and your desktops, and this intelligent feed and these actions. So really, this is making a hub where you have everything. Whereas I assume if you're using Power Apps, that would mean you go to Power Apps for your workflows, and you'll still need to go to the workspace to use your apps and desktops. So by using Workspace with intelligence, you can bring everything into a single portal, which is really kind of the key push behind all of this.
Right. So, and yeah, maybe that's a topic for a future blog post to kind of tease those things around. And another great question. How would we think about testing micro apps and maybe even automating those tests?
So that is a very good question. So we actually have something coming very soon on this. So I won't say too much because obviously it's not public just yet, but we are looking at solving this problem. So we will be trying to make public very soon some tooling to allow you to beginning writing proper tests for these. As it stands today, unfortunately, you'll be stuck to kind of doing it manually. But certainly that's something that's on our radar and should be, fixed or give you the tools available.
So, Tom, maybe you can pop back a slide to those Twitter handles and the newsletter, because you will certainly hear about any developments in testing and automation at those locations. And then we just have time for one final question. A caveat is that let me just read the question back, because I think you might have already answered this. Another caveat could be that flows in Power Automate are per user, opposed to Logic apps that does about the same.
Okay, I don't know what Logic apps is either. My expertise in the Microsoft ecosystem is not broad enough. But yeah, so the way Power Automate works with the flows is that you can have individuals create their own flows, but that does not work well with the way that Citrix Workspace is architected. So with the workspace, you have a central admin who administers those systems and builds the workflows and the integrations. So this means that if you have all of the users in your company each build their own flows, it becomes very hard for an admin to integrate all of those and understand what they should look like. So the assumption I've had with the things that I've built is that you would be having use cases where the admin would be the one who builds the flow themselves, and they'd be building it in a way where it should be generically useful for all of their users without having those users build it for themselves.
So it sounds like this is essentially just a slightly different use case there. This is central creation and then rolling it out to an enterprise, rather than allowing power users to build their own integrations.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so with that, I guess we're up to the time. So I'd like to thank you, Tom, for putting this all together. It's awesome content and a very very clear demo. And I'll encourage all of you listening to please subscribe to the developer newsletter and get a heads up on future webinars, and follow one or both of those Twitter accounts. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.